Hello and welcome to the Revision screencast on sport and society and the emergence evolution of sport in Britain. So what we're going to be looking at particularly our kind of time period today. We're going to be looking at how social and cultural factors shape the characteristics of and participation in sports and pastimes in post-1850 industrial Britain. So this is our key checkpoint now. We're moving from pre-industrial to post-industrial. Okay, so as a slight addition to the social and cultural factors, as you'll see this amateurs and professionalism. So we have a look at our time period then. So we started off last kind of revision screencast. We had looked at like kind of the social and cultural factors influence in pre-industrial sports and pastimes using the acronym CLEGIT. Now what we have to do, once we've collected it across through there, now we've got to add a little bit to it. So if we imagine our little running man there going through the time periods, might now have a cap on it. Okay, so cap legate. So what we're looking now then is it changes slightly, because what happens in post-industrial or post-1850 industrial Britain is we have a new class. Okay, so we don't only have two classes now, we have a change in there. And this actual change in the number of classes dictated how or why people took part in sports and pastimes. So if you're an amateur, you took part for certain reasons. If you're professional, you took part in other reasons. And, that could even be in the same sport, which I'll have a look at in a minute. Obviously, class still dictated these key things here, but there started to be changes because of this industrialisation of post-1850 Britain. So let's have a look then. So that's our kind of key timeline. We're kind of moving through those times now. We're on to here. So let's have a look. Social and cultural factors then, key things. When we're looking at post-1850 industrial Britain, we've got a couple of things to consider. The Industrial Revolution. So what we had then is this kind of a kind of urbanisation of Britain. Okay, so what we had is we started to have the formation of cities, and these cities had kind of industry or trade that were in these certain areas. So for example, in Sheffield you would have like steel works, in Manchester you'd have cotton mills, or Yorkshire for example. And what we kind of got here is say, right, so this is the kind of things that happen. So you had these factories or the formation of factories, but alongside that, okay, and the other massive change in kind of the British landscape, which links to sport as well, is that you had kind of this section here. So you had the kind of introduction of the railway. So you had increased transport links, which had massive impact on sport, both as a spectator thing and actually participating in it. So when you think about this, you've kind of got these factories starting. So this kind of had a big link to kind of the changing classes, because of course now, post-industrial Britain, we had kind of the emergence of the middle class, who would often be the owners of these factories, and they would employ lower class people. Eventually that would have links to sport, which I'm sure you can start to see where I'm going with this. They're the two key things, I suppose. Factories, railways had massive repercussions for the kind of development of sport in this period. So let's have a look then. So we'll start off the kind of activities that you can use through this. I think real tennis can still be used at this point. We also have cricket again can be used. Association football now, because we start to get to this point where we have to call it football and not mob football. On top of this, we have kind of cockfighting being reduced, or animal baiting in general being reduced. And we need to know why. Lawn tennis is a really important activity here, and hunting again can be linked to a specific class there. So what we need to do then is kind of, these are activities that I've kind of put them on there. You might make a note of these, and then as you're going through the screencast you might start to think of examples where you can put them in. They will be done there, but these are just examples from this time period. So let's have a look then, starting off. So what we've got now, of course, is our acronym changes from CLEGIT to CAPLEGIT. So what we've got to do, the first thing we have to do is, what's the key change? What we're looking at now is what's changed, okay, in post-1850 Britain. So class now, we've gone away from this feudal to class society, and now what we've got is the emergence of a new middle class. So, and the key thing we have to do is, so what we're saying is a new middle class, so it's a three-class society. Now, class still dictated to a massive extent the kind of activities that are played. So first of all, if we just go across this way, because whenever you talk about class, we're talking about this three-class society now, emergence of middle class. We've got to be able to, we'll always get marks, or application marks, AO2, we'll always get these marks for giving examples of each one. So if I look at this, so upper class, you could still use real tennis, okay? It's still a thing that kind of made the upper class exclusive from this new middle class, okay? So we've got that. So first of all, so you've got upper class. Then you've got lower class. They continued with football, but instead of being mob football now, they couldn't do mob football anymore, because the urbanisation and kind of the mass migration to the cities with these kind of, there wasn't space to play mob football. So now they had to start playing organised, a little bit more organised versions of football. And down to here, we can go to the middle class then. This is quite possibly the most important thing we need to make sure. Not only do we have the emergence of a new class, e.g. the middle class, we also had a sport that kind of symbolized this kind of emergence. And this was lawn tennis. And lawn tennis was a specific link to the middle class. It was a kind of Sir Walter Wingfield who actually created this, an ex-army major, and created this set that involved kind of putting a net up, 2 rackets, a ball, and basically this is linked to the middle class, and they could do this now because they had back gardens. Okay, so the new middle class had kind of houses where they had back gardens in a rectangle shape that was perfect for lawn tennis. Okay, so this is really important. Do not get the middle class preserve of kind of lawn tennis mixed up with real tennis. Okay, real tennis was exclusive to the upper class. Middle class weren't allowed to play this, so they wanted to do lawn tennis. Lawn tennis, of course, was exclusive to the middle class. They excluded kind of the lower class from doing that, who played activities such as football, boxing, things like that. So if we go through from there, then class, we first of all always go across. We always have to link it to activities. That gets us our kind of examples. And now, of course, because we've got 3 classes, you've got 3 potential marks you can get from kind of identify different classes linked to activities. But of course, not only does it go across laterally in terms of activities, we also know that class, or we will know now, that class dictated these 2 key things here. So not only what you played, but why you played certain sports and activities. So what we had then, upper class, a middle class, played sport as gentlemen amateurs, but the focus was kind of on these intrinsic values such as enjoyment, taking part, born out of the public schools. Okay, and it was not based around financial gain. Why? Because it was considered sacrilege for them to get paid for something where they didn't need it, because they didn't need finances. It wasn't kind of vital for them to earn money from activities. They wanted to do it for enjoyment. So examples, okay, so it's a good way of looking at this now is to say that you had these sports that kind of both classes played together. So you had things like, for example, cricket allowed both amateurs and professionals to play in the same team. So, but the difference is, of course, that the professionals were playing to win for money, okay, whereas the amateurs were playing for enjoyment. Yes, if they won, great, but it wasn't the sole purpose, and certainly no money. Now, how was it different? Okay, so sometimes you had this situation, it's quite bizarre really, where you had professionals from the lower class teaming up with actual middle class and upper class gentlemen amateur cricket players. But obviously, things stayed the same for pre-industrial. There was different roles, so they tended to be batsmen for the upper and middle class gentlemen amateurs. But also, the gentlemen amateurs would have different names on the programme. For example, they'd be followed by a squire. They'd have changing rooms that were way better in terms of facilities, and obviously the reasons for playing were the same. So the professionals were solely there to win, whereas gentlemen amateurs were there to enjoy themselves, and if they won, great, as long as it was fair. So going down from here, lower class played their activities professionals and were paid. So if they were playing football together, the professionals were there to be paid, and often we'll look at that a little bit more when we go down to the factories in a second. So if we have a look at that, hopefully that gives you an idea. If I take that off for a second, amateur and professional was why they played. And you also need to know how the 2 classes link together for that. So if we go from there then, now we're going to law and order. So we looked at before, pre-industrial times, a very limited amount of law and order. And now this started to change. So post-1850, we had the introduction of 2 key organisations that kind of dictated the characteristics of how people played sport in post-1850 Britain. So if we have a look. It was now the introduction of a police force and the RSPCA. And this kind of was kind of symbolic or kind of synonymous, I suppose, with the kind of civilising process in society. Okay, so these 2 things really kind of symbolising this, or going alongside it. So if we go across here, then what did this mean for activities? Well, reduction in activities such as bare knuckle fighting, cockfighting, wagering was started to be controlled, and we kind of had this move towards a more civilised society when playing sport. Going on then, education and literacy. So what we had then is this kind of Forster Education Act. Okay, so Forster Education Act then in 1870. What this did is it led to the kind of the start point of saying there needed to be a national state education. So the idea was that lower class now, working class people were actually given an education. Now this didn't really have a massive impact because, upper class, middle class were still being educated in the public schools and getting a very good education and grounding in sport, as you'll see when you look at the public schools separately in this period. But, the idea was that people could now, if they went to school, they might be able to read and understand a little bit more complex rules. But the reality was was in a time that was kind of, massively linked to factories and employment. A lot of children were still working in these factories and not necessarily doing any school at this point until we get to the 1900s. So what I've put onto here is to say that, right, the upper class and middle class were educated, okay, and when they left these kind of schools, these public schools such as Eton, Harrow, Malvern College, etc., these ex-public school boys, what they were using their education and literacy to create national governing bodies such as the FA in 1863. Okay, so they were using this education to create games and activities that people could play. Lower class, they still, although there was this Education Act, which can be worth a mark as a reference point in the exam, it was still limited in terms of how it was impacting people's sport, because it didn't really have that much of an impact on the sports they were playing, certainly in the schools at that point. So key thing there is to link it to that section. So going on from there, what we need to now have a look at is kind of this concept of gender. So obviously the gender we're concerned with here is kind of, ultimately Victorian Britain dictated that it was still a kind of male dominated society. However, we put it onto here, although there was kind of Victorianism was kind of stopping women from kind of doing a lot of things, and it was still a male dominated society, and activities were not, certainly if they were going to do anything, it was not allowed to be vigorous or competitive. And this was a kind of a perfect example of, not only was it the activity we talked about earlier as almost a symbol of the emergence of the middle class, i.e. lawn tennis, it also worked as a kind of vehicle for the emancipation or the liberation of women. So now we had this kind of activity that could not only symbolise the emergence of the middle class, but it could also act as this kind of stepping stone, this catalyst for the kind of emancipation, liberation of women. So what you had then is women were allowed to play lawn tennis, and this was considered okay. However, obviously this kind of concept of emancipation of women was a little bit flawed in the way that kind of you're allowing women to take part in tennis, but this was because it was covered up and it was often behind fences in a garden. They had to play with a male in a doubles format. It was not vigorous, it was not competitive, they didn't have to work hard, they could cover their bodies up. So although it was a start point for the liberation of women and showing that they can actually take part in sport, there was still lots of questionable points behind this as a real emancipation point. Okay, so going on from there, income, of course, class was still massively dictating income. So what we have then, obviously you had the middle class earning lots of money from factories and trade. Okay, upper class born to money with big estates and lands which were dictated. So, and the lower class now was starting to get paid for factory work. It wasn't great, but as the kind of the move towards the 20th century came, they were getting paid a little bit more. And how can we link this to kind of how it works? How did this influence the characteristics of sport? Well, what you had is you had upper class were still doing things that allowed kind of needed expensive equipment, e.g. kind of real tennis rackets or hunting, like horses, for example, when they were hunting. Middle class, they had money, okay, so they were these factory owners, kind of in the middle class coming from the export. They could afford to buy things such as lawn tennis sets. So again, your application mark here, get another one. And then the lower class, now because they were getting this factory money, they could actually now start to afford the ticket price for football games, so as spectators. But also, if you want to make an extra little point here, you had this concept now, and I might talk about it a little bit more down here, is you had this concept of kind of the income. The lower class could also receive something called broken time payments. And this basically referred to the fact that when they started to play now for the factory football team, they were reimbursed for any time they missed on the Saturday for playing for the football team, that they would have lost earnings for the factory. So now the factory owners, who were often the football team owners within the factories, for example, the Woolwich Arsenal gun-making factory, they were then getting some money back. And this is kind of the start point of professional sport. So income, upper class had it, lots of it, so they could do expensive activities such as this. Lawn tennis for middle class could afford the sets, and lower class could have, but they could also, for participation in football, they were getting paid via broken time payments. So time, massive key point here. So acts led to kind of Saturday half day, or sort of Wednesday early closing movement in shops. So this led to more time for the lower class, which allowed more opportunities to participate. So if you look onto here, the upper class had lots of time. Okay, so they could go do long activities such as hunting. The middle class had kind of time to go and do afternoons games of lawn tennis, and the lower class, they had Saturday afternoons to start playing football in football leagues. Now on top of that, you had this concept of transport. Now the introduction of the railways allowed sport to be played kind of nationwide. So it could be regular, and it could be regional, and it could be national. So what that meant was it allowed teams and spectators to go and watch football games. For example, and this is really important, now you could have the FA Cup because common rule books, as a result of the education literacy in the middle class, will allow people to play. If I just turn this over now, a quick revision task, if you could just pause it.